Yes, guys, what is going on? Welcome back to another episode of the Adapt Performance Podcast. So in this episode, I am going to be one-man wolf packing it again. Okay, so I've got a few things that I do want to talk about. A few things that we're going to kind of get into, a few questions that people have asked on the Instagram Q&As. And then generally, I just have like a really cool story. Or maybe not even a story, just something really interesting that I thought is worth sharing because we're all involved in the performance space and we're looking at trying to make ourselves better. So I will get into those and I'll kind of give you a little bit of a rundown of what we're going to cover. What have I been up to? This weekend, I'm off to a comedy show, which is sick. Really excited for that. I live in Sheffield and we've got at City Hall, they do, it's called the Last Laugh comedy show. So tickets are pretty cheap. It's not like you'll pay loads and loads and loads. I think they do 2 a week. It's basically stand-up comedy. They've got some tables around, people have a few drinks, a bit of food, whatever. Been quite a few times and it's sick. It's really, really good. And they have like a different 3 comedians on every single night, I guess. And then they have the main guy that kind of hosts it, who comes in between and just roasts people. And so far, like all the nights I've been to have been quality. Really enjoyed them, and luckily this is probably it's up there as maybe one of my worst fears in this situation, is being roasted, because they will just take the piss out of people. You've got all walks of life in there, so it's going to be really easy for the comedians. They're just going to have a set amount of jokes that they're just going to drill into people. But yeah, I can handle getting roasted in a group setting when you're with the boys or you're in the rugby, whatever. When you're around people that it's cool. But I dread the thought that somebody's going to attack me for being me. So that's my sob story. But yeah, that's the weekend plans. And then this week's been busy, mad busy actually. There's been a lot of good things going on with Adapt at the moment. We're really building out a lot of the resources that we're trying to give to our athletes, just to give them everything that they need. I've done a lot of coaching this week. So generally, like an average coaching week for me is like 15 hours. So roughly 3 hours a day, but it doesn't really sit as 3 hours a day. It kind of gets spaced out a little bit. I usually do 2 longer days in a week and then I have a few shorter days, just the way that I prefer to work. And it just makes a lot of sense for me. But yeah, really busy coaching week, loads of programs to write, loads of planning. It's been good. It's been really, really good. But yeah, right, without further ado then, let's get into some of the topics. And the first one, I'll give you a little bit of a backstory, and you will have heard me speak about him before on this. So this concept came from Phil Dixon, who is the guy who hires me to work with the mountain bikers. So he is the performance manager for Cannondale riding team. Okay, so he's got wealth of experience, comes from a British cycling background. Just generally been in performance for a long while, and just has a huge catalogue of accomplishments behind him. When you jot it down on paper, it's mad, but when you meet him in person, you start to get an idea of how he's kind of crafted this, and nothing's an accident. He's an absolute brain box, and it's all pre-thought out, But what we were speaking about is something he labeled the James Bond effect. Okay. And I went away and Googled it, and it's not an actual thing in the sense that, because the James Bond effect, just for anybody that isn't aware, has a few different definitions on Google. Okay. So the James Bond effect is the idea that James Bond, the franchise, has, I don't know how many different actors have played James Bond. Let's say 7. Okay. You got Sean Connery, you got Pierce Brosnan, and that's the only 2 I know, but I know there's more. And the idea of the James Bond effect is, if you used to ask somebody who's seen it what their favorite actor is, who is James Bond to you, it's the first person. Okay. It's the first person they ever saw in that role. That is who they consider to be the best. Okay. Which is interesting actually, because I think there's sometimes parallels with that in coaching and PT and S&C and all that, because I've spoken to a few people in the past around, who their favorite coaches are, not athletes that I've coached, so they're not going to give me the idea that you are the best coach or anything like that. But they will often say, the first coach I ever had was amazing. He taught me this, he taught me that. And I think that's really good. I think there's probably an element of survivorship bias there, If they had good coaches, they're more likely to have multiple coaches in the future because they've been put off on a really good path, which is super interesting. The ones that had shit coaches in the beginning may have been put off the fitness and the strength and conditioning and performance path before they even got a chance to have a second. Not always, but it's a slightly different take on it. But what I think with the James Bond effect, and let's say you say that your first coach is the one who you value as the best, I think they've probably got the biggest potential to make change. Okay, if you go to them and you're brand new, you don't move very well, you haven't really experienced much strength or power, we know that you're going to be super susceptible to gains. Okay, you're going to get strong as shit. You're going to get all these adaptations really easy because everything's new to you. It's novel. Okay, there's an analogy that I use fairly often. So like a new athlete that hasn't really trained before is like a tube of toothpaste. Okay, press anywhere and you will get something out of it. And that is essentially what it's like working with a new athlete. Press anywhere and you will get something out of it. As you start getting more and more advanced and all those easier gains, those little pushes have come out of the toothpaste tube, and you start working with people that have experienced all these different training programs, and they're generally a lot stronger, a lot more adapted, a lot more powerful, they move better, all those things. You need to be really specific in where you push it. You need to roll it up. You need to squeeze. It may take you 10 squeezes to get that last little bit out. But anyway, I've gone off on one there. So when you're a new athlete, I think that the coach has a lot of work to do. Can make a lot of progress with not a lot. They can give you a lot of things. So I think your potential is going to be really realized in that time. So I think that might be potentially why we view the James Bond effect and the first coach you ever get is actually what you consider to be the best one. It's not always the case. It's definitely not always the case, but I thought it was a really interesting little concept when I dove into it. So that's the backstory, right? So that's the backstory, getting into the actual point. So Phil calls it, the James Bond effect, or trying to be James Bond. And for anybody that's seen the films, he's a little bit of a lad in a sense. Everything, he kind of comes out on top. He has a little bit of a battle, has a bit of a war, gets into some fights, but he comes out of it generally unscathed. Okay, and he puts on his tuxedo and he walks about his business. He acts like a professional, super confident in his ability to go in, do the job, figure shit out, and afterwards you pop on your tux and you crack on. Okay, you go in to execute a job. He is supremely confident in all those things. And we were speaking about ways that we can build confidence in an athlete. Okay, and you know what, it was super interesting because everyone's totally different. Everyone gets their confidence from different places. Okay, some people get their confidence from knowing that they've put in all the work from the start of the season, or the start of the preseason to the end of preseason. Okay, they've used the off season well, or their fight camp has been super effective, or you know what, let's change it to careers. Okay, you get your confidence knowing you're a good whatever your career is because of the success you've had in the past. Okay, so using that previous experience as a way of, you know what, I've got to this point because I deserve it. All right. So we were speaking about that. We were speaking about different training methods. We were talking about, okay, are there certain things you can do with them in the gym, Jordan, that's going to make them feel good about themselves? And I was like, absolutely, 100%. I feel like I will make decisions sometimes, not based off the best adaptation, because sometimes you've got a choice of two exercises going to provide similar adaptations. They both make sense from a structural perspective, a logistics perspective, and you're like, okay, well, which one do I choose? One of the things that may push you in one direction over the other could be the fact of, you know what, I know he likes those, or I know he gets a mad pump from that exercise, or I know he said that he feels super springy after doing this thing. Okay, so as a coach, you're always using those little nuggets of information just to try and build it into the program. Okay, right, well, maybe this is an opportunity. We're really far away from the camp, or the end competition. Maybe I use this as an opportunity to actually give him some discomfort. Okay, give him shit that he doesn't like. Okay, and I'm not saying you need to make their life a living hell or anything like that and make it super horrible, but there is an element of training where, yeah, no shit, you are going to be uncomfortable. You're going to do stuff that you don't like, and I think there's a certain amount of resilience that is born from that. just grit and just absolutely get it. So yeah, it was a really interesting, try to be James Bond. And I do not coin that term, and that's not my idea in the sense of James Bond, but I think the confidence building is something that we do, through exercise selection, through the way that you are peaking them, adjusting the training variables to create a certain amount of freshness so they start feeling better in the gym, they start feeling better in competition. That's where you can start to build this confidence. I've used this as an example before, but lads are one of those types of beings that want to look good naked. They want to have a certain amount of sex appeal to them, for lack of a better term. Okay. And the same for girls, actually. I don't know why I just said lads, but I think I've had more experience with lads being pretty upfront with the fact that they're like, fucking, I want a six pack. Yeah. I want that. I want my arms to be bigger. I want some cap delts, whatever. Girls less so, but they do, and when they do it, it's super helpful because it gives us something to work with. So yeah, I think the James Bond, I try and take that forward with you. When you're thinking about your training, have a little think about some of the things that you've done in the past that you think will make you feel super confident. What are some of the things you can do so you can ingrain that confidence more? Okay, so you can start stacking those little wins, and start building until you get to a point where you're operating at your best because you've managed to silence that voice in your head. So that was the first one that I wanted to speak about, because I thought that was so interesting. I really like it. I like psychology anyway, but it kind of directly feeds into working with people. So, okay, so the next one is talking around the concept of pre and post exhaust training methods. Okay, so I'm going to give a little bit of a rundown of what a pre-exhaust and a post-exhaust training method is, and then we'll kind of get into some of the pros and the cons and how I see that being used and what the research says and all those things. So first off, a pre-exhaust training method. So essentially, let's say your main exercise of the day is going to be a bench press, okay? So you're going to bench press, which is a great exercise for your triceps, your chest, and your shoulders, and people use the bench press most of the time. Well, not most of the time, but they do use it as a way of kind of building some big boobs, essentially, using it as a way of really kind of getting the pecs nice and strong. The other exercise you would do in this pairing would come beforehand. So you would directly try to pre-exhaust or tire out the muscle group that you are trying to get more benefit to. So if we're using bench press, we would do dumbbell pec flies or cable crossovers or something that is an isolation exercise for the chest, okay? So we go isolation exercise, then we go compound exercise. And it's usually done in bodybuilding circles a lot more, okay? Physique sports, that type of thing. And the idea is that, you're going to go in, you're going to tire out that muscle earlier, okay? A way of kind of exhausting all the slow twitch muscle fibers, the fast twitch muscle fibers, getting all that done so that when you go into the bench press, it's that much more effective. You've already done half of the work. You have, what is it when you cook chips? You part blanch them? Yeah, you just boil them pre, okay? So you do that beforehand. So in terms of what the research actually says from this, then let's kind of go there. When comparing it over sessions, okay, so if you do a traditional training session where you just do bench press, okay, and then we compare that to when you do a pre-exhaust where you do pec flies, then you do bench press, you do less overall volume if you do the pre-exhaust. So you don't do as many reps because let's say you'll go into failure on the bench press, you've already tired out one of the main prime movers, so you're not going to be able to get the same, okay? So less overall volume, again, which is a good or a bad thing. You see similar gains, okay? You see similar gains in those two things. There seems to be the same muscle activation between the two training methods in the studies that I've read, okay? The problem is, the studies aren't necessarily amazing, okay? When we think about studies, you've got to take them with a pinch of salt, okay? Comparing, somebody that's trained for 10 years in powerlifting to somebody who is untrained, you cannot compare the same things. Think about the toothpaste analogy that I said before, okay? Which also I stole. I did not, I didn't come up with that. It's too smart for me. They're going to get totally different effects from the same training method. So the studies are not great. But from what they've said, less overall volume, you get similar gains. The muscle activation is the same. But the thing is, what they've found is it kind of works the opposite of what we think. Because you're pre-exhausting the chest before the bench press, you expect it to get more to the chest, but actually we find the triceps and the shoulders end up increasing the amount of work that they do because the chest is now, fatigued. Okay, so you're almost doing the opposite of what you want in a sense. Okay, so that's what the research says. Personally, I've done this in the past. I feel like I've done a lot of different training methods in the past, and I've worked with a lot of different people that have done a lot of training methods in the past. So you're always building up those little bits of anecdotal evidence, but it's nice in a way. Okay, so you get a really good kind of mind muscle connection when you do that pre-exhaust. So you tire out your chest, you do 10, 15, 20 reps, whatever, and then you go into your bench. You can feel your chest working. Okay, that's fantastic. You get an absolute mad pump. All right, you really do. And can that feed into some of the main mechanisms of hypertrophy? So when we think about hypertrophy, it comes in a three. The first one is mechanical tension, which is essentially you need to get stronger over time. You're constantly thinking about trying to overload. Okay, that is the main mechanism of hypertrophy. But the other two, we've got muscle damage, and then we've got metabolic stress. So doing a pre-activation thing for the chest is going to elicit, you're going to swell up. Yeah, so you may get a little bit of growth there, which probably, to be honest with you, if we're seeing same muscle growth from the two different types of studies, I think it's probably because the mechanical tension piece comes down a bit and the metabolic stress piece goes up a bit. So you end up in this kind of middle ground. And yeah, I think that mind muscle connection thing is an important piece, to be honest with you. So just want to make sure when we do the pre-exhaust and the pre-exhaust, for example, that is different to doing an isolation exercises or doing isolation exercises earlier on in the session and then transitioning to your compound. Okay, that is a different thing, because I'm all for both training methods, to be honest with you. They work in the situations that they work in. You just use your common sense, trial and error, a little bit of experimenting, and use your critical reasoning to get to a point where you think it's appropriate. But I'm all for doing isolation exercises earlier on, okay? A way of tiring out those muscle groups so that when you do go into those exercises later on, you don't need as much weight to get the same effect. I do think that is a good thing. If we think about squats, let's say you're somebody that suffers with a little bit of back pain. I've been there myself, okay? You're usually somebody that can squat. Let's say I can squat 160, okay? 160 kilo for 5 reps. All right, so that is basically where my body is at in terms of me trying to create adaptation. I'm going to try and budge that up a little bit, either through sets, reps, volume, whatever. 160 kilo. Let's say I get a back injury. All right. Well, one of the ways that you can make sure that your legs still get strong and still kind of ingrain that squat pattern is tire your legs out before. Okay. So get super strong through your leg presses, get super strong through your leg curl, your leg extension, glute bridges, all those things. Then go into the squat. So now you will not need 100, you won't need 160 kilo for your squat because you've already tired out some of the main muscle groups below. So now you can get away with 100 kilo. So there's definitely thought processes in that, and you may go back and forth with research and they may say, this is good, this is bad. Research is one piece of the puzzle, okay? It's going to say a lot of things forever, okay? But at some point you're going to have to dig in and do it, just to know whether it actually does work for you and your population. Okay, so that's from an adaptation standpoint of pre-exhaust. Okay, so that's thinking about, okay, well, what are the gains actually saying? You know what? And it seems to be similar. Okay, there doesn't seem to be huge, benefits or drawbacks either way. But from a movement and teaching perspective, pre-exhaust has a lot of benefits. Okay. So say, for example, if we kind of take hypertrophy and bodybuilding, off the stage, and let's look at, okay, if we're trying to get people to move well, okay, in thinking about using cues and different exercises to get them to feel a certain sensation before going into exercise to make sure that exercise is more effective, okay? So for example, if we was to do... I've done this in the past, right? So if somebody is not grasping the action of pogos, right? So a pogo jump, so hops, okay? They're not grasping that. They can't get the dorsiflexion, so bringing the toes up towards the shin. They can't get the plantar flexion, so pushing the toes down towards the floor. They can't get that plyometric action. It doesn't work for them very well. I've done, those exercises in a slower controlled setting. So literally just doing some calf raises, okay? Yeah, you are getting some pre-exhaust to the gastroc, the soleus, the calf muscles. That's not necessarily the intention. I do want them to feel that they are there, but I'm more bothered about the actual movement that they are going through and trying to relate that to the movement that we're trying to feed in. Same thing is doing like some tib raises. So trying to bring the toes up towards the shin, let them drop. You can do them against the wall. You can do them with a band, whatever. But by doing these exercises, and thinking, well, okay, calf raises or, dorsiflexion, whatever it is, you get them to feel a certain way, okay? You're ingraining that thought in their head and in their mind that this is the way that is supposed to feel, slow and controlled. So now let's try and feed that back into the system. If we think about sports, okay, let's think about a closed skill of throwing a rugby ball, okay? Throwing a rugby ball, you're throwing it to a partner, they're going to throw it back. You're throwing it to a partner, you're going to throw it back. It's really controlled. It's the same thing over and over again. Once you start getting really good at that, you can then start adding a little bit more dynamic to it, okay? So now you're going to run and do it. So you run in, you've layered on some complexity to that skill. Okay, well now, you've mastered that. You feel like you can do it in a variety of directions at a variety of speeds. So now we're going to try and make that a little bit more reactive. So that's essentially what I'm getting at there is sport and sports science and coaching and all those things. We're all doing the same stuff, just slightly different iterations of that thing, starting with simple and then building up to complex. So that's what we've got. I think pre-exhaust has benefits, it has drawbacks, but give it a go and see where you kind of land with that. Post-exhaust. So yeah, right, just to finalize that then. I do use pre-exhaust. I use it more to improve the movement by giving them some reference to what we want, okay? That's essentially how I use it. But that's not right, that's not wrong, that's just my preference. Post-exhaust, okay, this will be a little bit quicker. Post-exhaust exercise, again, it is a superset targeting similar muscle groups, but now you're going to go from compound exercise to isolation exercise in the same muscle group. So bench press, tire out your bench, smash it, and then go on to doing some pec flies. Okay, so that makes more sense from a hypertrophy standpoint because essentially you're getting to a point where you are stimulating the muscle through the big compound, and then you are essentially extending that set for that specific muscle group to take it past failure, cause a lot more fatigue of the muscle fibers, the high threshold motor units. We're getting all those to a point where, we need to signal for some hypertrophy to take place. Again, and you also get a mad pump. So that one is a little bit more, I think, I haven't looked at the research. So I don't think there is a ton of research on that, but I think that is more clear cut in my mind and it makes sense. You will get less volume when you do that, when you compare it to traditional because you're tiring it out. So I think you're almost, if you're going to do a pre or a post exhaust and compare that to traditional, you're just going to have to be honest with yourself and know that you are going to get a difference in total volume because traditional is generally pretty good at getting that volume. If you're going to layer on it exercises and fatigue, it makes sense. Okay. But try them. This could be the takeaway. Go and have a go because it's nice, okay? And I think there's an element of just enjoying training and going back to the James Bond piece, okay, of leaving there with a little bit more of a pump and a feeling like things are going well. And you're definitely going to increase things like muscular endurance as well, okay, buffering capacity, all those things that are definitely important for sports away from just pure strength. Right, so I'm going to get a drink. Bear with. Okay, so the next question then was, what are my thoughts on going into personal training post-grad? Okay, so this is after they have completed their masters, if S&C is your objective. So once more, what's my thoughts on going into personal training post-grad if S&C is your objective? So me and Mitch on the last podcast spoke about, personal training. I think I've spoke about this a bit before as well. I come from like a little bit more of a personal training background. I have friends that are in really high up S&C positions. You know, they're doing great things in professional sport, elite sport, Olympic sport, and you know, just at all levels. It doesn't necessarily need to be high performers. You know, it can be grassroots. But I genuinely feel like people that have come from a personal training background, or not necessarily, well, actually, yeah, I do feel like people that come from a personal training background are generally just pretty good at dealing with people. Okay, they have a really good awareness of how to speak to people. They are able to converse with people on topics other than just sport. Okay, they're able to speak to people about things other than sport, and I think there is a little bit of people that go into sports science and become those sports science nerds are so wrapped up in the X's and O's and the R values and all these things that they do just become a bit robotic, a bit boring to speak to sometimes, if I'm honest with you, and they're not able to build that real connection. Whereas personal trainers, if you can speak to somebody about Love Island, you can speak to somebody about, oh, I had that problem with my car. I don't know shit about cars. But if you're able to just generally roll with it and build connection, I think you're going to be a better coach because of that PT experience. That's not the only way you're going to get it, obviously. Personal training isn't necessarily the correct path to being a good S&C coaches, but I do feel that it is a valid path. When we think about personal training, you're able to practice your coaching cues hours and hours on end. If you can explain it to somebody who's never moved, you're probably going to be pretty good at explaining it to somebody who's got a decent training background. Okay, you've got a way of referring your cues back to being something super simple that anybody can understand. Same goes for working with youth sport. Okay, if you can explain it to somebody in a youth sport setting, you're probably going to be able to explain it to somebody that's got a decent training background. So there's huge benefits to the PT. So yeah, I think coaching skills is definitely one of them. Communication skills is another one. I'm all for that. But I wouldn't necessarily stop doing S&C to do PT to then come back to S&C again. I think try and do both. Okay. I still think if S&C is your end goal, using S&C as the most important thing, and everything feeds into that process. So you still want to be doing that. You still want to be pushing that forward and use the PT as a supplement to that. You know, and I still have personal training clients. Like I have general population that just want to look a little bit better and be healthy. I mostly work with athletes though. So yeah, I think that's a really simple one for me. Do it, but I think when you start going down this route of personal training, some of the things that, you know, I know personal trainers struggle with is you're no longer really going to be just about the athletes or the clients in front of you. You're going to have a lot of things to deal with that may kind of sap your energy for the job. Cleaning, if you're doing shift work, you're going to have to deal with managers that you may not align with if your personal biases are geared towards, you know, performance, I guess you could say. Like you will get a lot of managers in kind of commercial gyms and that type of thing that don't really get it, you know. They will do great things, but they just don't get it to the same level. Personal training is a really, really good thing, and I feel like it's demonized, and I think it's demonized very, very wrongly. But okay, that was where my point was going. Don't necessarily, it could be so easy just to get stuck. Okay, it could get stuck to drop into that personal training area and just end up doing that for forever and being really comfortable. And I don't think it's necessarily going to be a comfortable existence. I think you're going to have to graft. I think you're going to have to try and build up your client base, which is super, super difficult to do. You're going to have to find yourself an actual home to coach out of, a base. You know, you've got the work-life balance things to balance and all that. But yeah, you won't get comfortable is probably the wrong word to say, but don't get into a situation where you feel like, you know what, you've lost that touch. I've had people say to me before, once you leave S&C, you know, for a few years out, it's hard to get back in. Okay, because there's not necessarily a continuation on your CV. There's not necessarily a continuation in your experience and the things that you're putting out there and the reputation that you're building for yourself. It's almost as if you're starting from scratch. So just think about those things. But I think you keep chasing the S&C stuff. You keep networking. If you know the sports that you want to work in, you need to attack those. You need to try and figure out a way of being in front of the people that have done that, learn their lessons, so that you don't have to learn them the hard way. Okay. So that's my thoughts. It's a really short and sweet one. Just around those two topics. PT, I'm all for it. If S&C is your goal, that's absolutely great. There's multiple routes to getting into it. But I do think it generally makes people's coaching skills a lot better. All right. Cool. So that is what I'm going to do for today. I've got a few more meetings today. I'm going to have a train. What I'm going to do, I have got a date with the pendulum press, the pendulum leg press. Don't know if anybody's ever used it, but it's absolutely gross. I've been using a lot more machines just to try and get more work through the legs. Hip doesn't always love, the big compounds. I still do them. I've started squatting again with a super heel elevation, which feels really nice because my torso's super upright. It generally just feels nice, and I get no hip pain. I get no back pain. So yeah, beautiful. So yeah, I've got a big leg machine day. So hopefully I'm going to be filling out my jeans before the comedy show tonight. Yeah. Read them. Sweet. So if you enjoy these episodes, do me a favor. Okay. Let me know you enjoy them. Just give me a little bit of feedback. Just say, okay, that was good. That was bad. Really enjoyed it. Share it with your friends. If you think that they will benefit from it, share it on social media, share it with anybody. Tell your nan about it, right? Go tell your nan about the Adapt Performance podcast. My nan actually did, she listened to one of my earlier podcasts. She listened to a bit of it. And she gave me some feedback, and she was like, that was really, really good. I just don't understand it. So, each to their own. And I was like, that is a classic nan. It's like a compliment, and she'll support me all the way. She don't fucking get it. She's not bothered, which is lovely. Yeah. Right. Anyway, less waffle from me. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Adapt Performance podcast. As always, thank you very much. Cheers, guys. Bye. Thanks for listening to the Adapt Performance podcast. Let me know what you thought about the episode by leaving a review or sending me a direct message. I'm all for receiving the honest feedback to make sure the episodes grow and get better and better. Like, share, subscribing and following all goes a long way to making sure the podcast reaches the right people. Thanks a lot. Catch you next time.